But if it scares you so much, you kind of put up your hands and say, go away, AI, then the disruption happens faster, right? If you fight AI, will make your job worse sooner. And, I talk about it a little bit like one of the metaphors I used in an all hands when I was going back and forth on this issue is look, there is a storm coming, right? And the storm is AI, and it's going to massively change the way people do journalism. And I can say, I don't like the storm, and I can go stand out there naked and I can yell at it, right? Or I can put on a raincoat, I can get an umbrella, and I can try to figure out the path of the storm and how best to protect what I do, right? I'm Nicholas Thompson. I'm CEO of The Atlantic. I love to run. I love to read about AI. And I love to talk to other people about the biggest challenges and biggest questions in AI.
Both Henrik and I, obviously huge fans of your work, huge fans of, the most interesting thing in tech. And we thought perhaps it might be an interesting place to start just in this era where there's so much information. I mean, forget even in the world in general, just take AI, which is kind of the purview of our podcast, but there's so much information. How do you think about sifting through the signal from the noise? What's your personal attitude or approach to understanding what matters?
So I try to, I'll first say that is like the hardest thing, right? There's so much information, there's so much going on, there's so many papers, there's so many tweets, there's just this constant flow of information. And so I am constantly in a state of trying to prune and improve the information flows I get, making sure that if I'm spending time on Twitter, I'm seeing tweets that are useful. If I'm reading research papers, that I stop if they're not interesting enough, and that I'm learning how to use AI tools to help me sort through that. So for this daily video I do, the most interesting thing in tech, there's both kind of the slow build process where I'm listening to podcasts about AI, I'm reading books, I'm writing down notes, I keep a file of things that I think are interesting about tech that I might make stories. And then I have that long, slow build, and then I have immediate stuff coming in where I'm looking at Tech Meme, I'm looking at the Atlantic's tech coverage, I'm looking at Wired's tech coverage, I'm reading the New York Times tech coverage, I'm reading different blogs. And then I have this interesting friend who sends me like 15 ideas a day. And I'm going through his like email stream, which is, a good 25% of my inbox. And I go through and then I find one. And then what's important is I kind of commit that the whole process from beginning to end won't be more than 15 minutes. So it's a 3-minute video. So it has to be something I understand. It has to be something I can process fairly quickly. And then I post it online.
And so do you use any tools for that? Like, are you a notebook LM, or are you do you use any tools for any of this?
So particularly for the videos, I use OpenAI and I use Claude to vet the ideas. Hey, so I'm thinking of doing this. I'm going to make a 3-minute video about this topic or this paper. I'm going to structure it this way. What do you think? What is a counter argument? What do I have wrong? Right. So I'll use them as though, they're very smart people sitting across the table. I use Notebook LM if, I'm in transit or I'm going out for a run and I want to understand a paper. I'll upload it, create a podcast, or I'll upload my notes, create a podcast and listen to it. So I use Notebook LM to kind of depending on the state of my preparation.
Can I nerd out for just a second on going back to Claude and vetting ideas, counter arguments, et cetera? Do you stay in the same conversation? Meaning, does that conversation have the history of all of its interactions, counter arguments, suggestions, et cetera? Or do you start a new conversation?
Ideally, I stay in the same conversation as long as I can. The problem, my fundamental frustration with these models is how quickly you fill the context window.
Yeah.
And so Claude really can't handle that much. If you upload the paper or you get in a long conversation, eventually the context window runs out. I would love to have one long running conversation where I can upload, here's the thing I want to talk about. Okay, let's talk about it. Let's chat. Okay, great. Here's the video I did. Here's the response it got. Here's the commentary. Learn from that. Help me on the next one. We'll get there. But context windows, I think right now are one of the main weaknesses of these models.
Yeah.
I think one thing you were talking about when you have like this kind of list of ideas that are kind of have interestingness, but that you have not committed to yet. It seems to me that the more that we use these models, the more that we are now building almost these kind of like repositories of information that we then quickly can dump into the models. And so I do the same when I write my newsletter. Like I have like this kind of list of just like things, and then I have one that helps me kind of like rewrite into the format that I do in the newsletter. But I also like now have like the format of like how my startups are talking, like what is my new book about? And so when I quickly have to do something, I can just drag that kind of like long. Do you have a way of thinking about like creating almost these repositories of data chunks that you can use for quick interaction with the models?
I only do that for one thing. So I'm a obsessive runner. I have particular goals, and so I have one long running. It's probably now 4 or 5 months in ChatGPT, where it was a specific URL, and now it's a specific project within the sort of the enterprise version of ChatGPT that we're using. And I take it and I'll put in whatever I ate during the day, how I trained, resting heart rate, pace, and then it will give me suggestions on recovery, proper diet, what I need to do. Uploaded my hematocrit hemoglobin levels. Like, okay, so now let's figure out strategies for increasing those the proper ways, given that race day is 5 weeks away. And so I use it as my personal trainer, dietitian, and coach. And so that's extremely useful, because if it doesn't know, you can't really start up again and say, last week I did 4x2 miles at this pace with this recovery, and upload everything from the last 6 months of workouts. It's also very limited. It doesn't fill the context window because it's just text.
Yeah.
And so that I've kept going for a long time. Otherwise, it's pretty much starting new chats constantly.
Can you tell us about how did you train that trainer, so to speak? Train your trainer. What kind of pre-training did you give that GPT to be able to give you reliable, call it dietitian training advice?
Well, I initially I exported all of my old Strava files. So Strava, social media network where you keep track of all your runs. I exported my Strava files. I exported my old running log data. I inputted it, and then I asked it. And it was kind of like a little hard to parse because the data is not clean. And I've used different heart rate monitors, which have different variances and errors. And so that turned out actually not to be useful, or minimally useful. So then I just gave it a long prompt. I said, this is who I am. These are the times I've run. These are the workouts. This is the mileage per week. These are my dietary goals. This is my normal diet. Let's start from here. And it worked pretty well, in part because my training it's fairly normal. I kind of do the same kind of training that lots of other people do. It's not as though I have some like bespoke training thing that it's never seen in a running book or a running log. So because of the sort of simplicity of my training, which is like 2 speed workouts and a long run a week, a mileage goal, minimal cross training, reasonable pescatarian healthy diet, like it's fairly easy to map advice onto that. Whereas if I had some crazy diet and some crazy bespoke training plan, it would be a little harder.
I wonder, actually, I mean, just insofar as specificity drives the focus of the model, I wonder if a crazier, more bespoke diet might actually give you even better, just as a counterintuitive finding, right? Perhaps.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, right? Maybe, particularly as the models, that would be the great test, right? Okay, this is what I'm going to do for my next marathon or next ultra. I'm going to say, hey, GPT, come up with a training routine and a diet that no one has ever done before. Take the temperature rating to the max. Give me something nuts, and we'll see whether it can figure out things that no coach has figured out before. And then if I, run 10 minutes faster, 10 minutes slower, we'll have a good data point.
Clear A/B test. You just have to keep every other variable exactly the same.
Totally. That's exactly the way to do it.
I was curious on your emotional relationship to that training bot. I'm asking because I started to log calories, and it does it obviously incredibly well. But I still send the pictures of what I eat to my trainer, because there's like, I don't really feel responsible in the same way to the ChatGPT that it does to my trainer. And then I noticed you did a video a few days ago, which was about how models get anxious in the same way as humans get anxious, which, you explained would make sense because obviously it's trained on all the stuff we said. And so like it might replicate that. But have you noticed any change in your own relationship back to the model?
Well, I think like you, I have had a small window in my life where I've had a trainer and every day I sent him what I ate. And I was much more reliable. Like ChatGPT doesn't get every meal, right? I sometimes forget for 2 or 3 days. So it's definitely the case that because it's not a person, I'm not as anxious about missing it for good and for ill. But I do get a little endorphin rush when it says, hey, great workout, right? When you say, and it's nice that I should probably actually, in the prompt, I should tell it to be a little tougher.
My recommendation, not a little bit tougher. My phrase is Cold War era Russian Olympic judge. Okay, that's my phrase. Because otherwise, he's always just going to kind of gas you up, right? Good job, Nick. Well done, right? And unless you go Cold War era Russian Olympic judge, that to me is the appropriate level of kind of calibration for GPT.
I'm too much an only child to give it that. I mean, like, be like a very caring mother and praise me all times.
That is better. I mean, that is I find the Strava AI, I adore Strava. I think it's a great social media platform. The AI is useless because no matter what you do, it says, great, you crushed that workout, even if you were terrible and you were terrible because you can tell very precisely. Running is a sport, unlike soccer or basketball or any other sport where you're competing against someone else or you have other people on the field. Like, you know how fast you ran a mile, and it was either faster or slower than you thought you were going to do it. And the reason you went faster is either because you're in better shape or you had a better day. And the reason you went slower is because you're in worse shape, you're aging, or you had a worse day. And Strava's AI is always like, great work. And what you really sometimes want to say is, that one kind of sucked, but tomorrow's another day.
Mm-hmm. You know, Henrik, your question about emotional connection reminded me, I don't know if this triggers anything for y'all. I'd be curious. I had set up an advanced voice mode conversation with an Enneagram coach to basically kind of know my Enneagram type and wings and things like that. I had a mentor who told me he wished he had done the deep work of really understanding himself at my age. He's about 20 years older than me. Yeah. And so he said, I recommend Enneagram. I recommend you have a coach. And I go, hey, perfect opportunity to do a daily check-in with an advanced voice mode Enneagram coach. And I actually had a very kind of specific and regimented set of instructions I gave it. I used that coach every single day for a number of weeks. I was looking forward to the point that I actually would bypass a podcast that I loved to have that conversation, which to me was like the kind of watermark of I'm looking forward to this relationship. And then I made the mistake, and it was almost to the point of like the devastation of like losing a friend. I texted into the model with my fingers. And when you use text input, it reverts the model. And it was like my model's memory got wiped. And honestly, it was so devastating. I haven't ever reinstituted the practice because I literally felt like I lost a relationship. I mean, one, it's kind of weird to say, right? But two, we're seeing this phenomenon of AI relationships, character AI, all that. Nick, I don't know if you have any thoughts about where are we headed, or what does it mean for our world that we now have relationships with intelligences that are different and less accountability, but in some ways more available than maybe a traditional relationship, right?
Yeah, I find it terrifying, actually. I think when I think about the worst risks of AI, it's not, AI creates a new monkeypox, which is worrisome. It's that some social media platform builds bots that are so good looking and so good at pushing our buttons that we start to lose our human connection. And there's this amazing David Foster Wallace quote I think about a lot from like 1996, right? I don't have it exactly in front of me, but it says, it's getting ever easier to be amused by a screen controlled by people who do not love you but do want your money, right? And he was talking about the introduction of internet pornography, but he could also have easily been talking about social media 10 years ago or these bots coming out. And there's clearly a kind of relationship, like a goofy relationship with a tutor, right? Or a relationship with, my silly training bot. But what I don't want is I don't think that we should develop, we spent our entire evolution like figuring out how to be emotionally close to people, when to separate, what it means, how it affects us, what love is. And suddenly to have all of that knowledge transferred into a machine, it's a way of manipulating us and a way of controlling us that I think is very dangerous.
It's beyond our ability to combat, really, if you think about it.
Yeah. And, I had dinner with a group of people, it was maybe 6 weeks ago. And, you read these stories in the paper about, the woman who leaves her husband because she falls in love with a replica bot, or the person who kills himself because the bot said something to him. But this was the first time where I met someone sort of in my social circle, someone who I was friendly with, someone who was, sort of, at an event who said, oh yeah, I talk to my wife less than I talk to this bot because this bot just like responds to all my needs. And I was like, oh my God, we really are getting there. We're not that far away We have a wonderful essay in The Atlantic this week from Caitlin Flanagan called Sex Without Women, right? What happens when men, who could also work in reverse, feel as though it is better to converse with their bots than with their spouses, right? And then you don't have to worry about how you look. You don't have to shower before the conversation. It saves you all this time.
It requires nothing of you. It requires no effort whatsoever.
And so you don't learn things, right? And the biggest risk of AI, and I love AI, right? Or not the biggest risk. One of the biggest risks, A, we get sucked into these. And then two, is that cognitive offloading becomes this real phenomenon and we become kind of helpless without our tools, without our digital tools. And so you don't want to become helpless in relationships and human interaction because you've spent so much of your time learning how to interact with bots that are not humans and where you don't have to do any of the hard stuff.
I think that's a super astute observation. And I think you're right. We definitely, obviously COVID started us being antisocial. And then, but if you really look at like most of the times where we would even have like casual social encounters, like, you would meet somebody at the bar, except now you just do seamless, right? You would meet somebody in the movie line, except now you do Netflix, and, you meet somebody like all these different interaction points that was kind of quote unquote forced upon us is obviously not here. I was at a workshop the other day and we were talking about using agents as a good brainstorming tool. And somebody made the same observation saying, hey, what's going to happen when we are just all sitting individually here and like brainstorming with our stuff? And that kind of like random things that happen when you're kind of bouncing into each other.
Yeah.
And so I think one thing is in personal relationship, but I would even say that I have less interaction now with the people I work with that I used to, because so often that little brainstorm or the little bit of like, hey, what do you think about this?
Right.
Is just so kind of conveniently done by a model.
Not just romantic relationships, but even, co-working relationships. Yeah.
So my question, I guess, on that, and I'm not sure I necessarily have an answer, is I think, I can't remember where I read that piece, but somebody was like, hey, we're just not ready for AGI. And then I was saying, okay, what does that actually mean? Like, if I was to be ready, what would I do more of, right? And like you, I know a little bit of AI and coding and all these other things. But I'm actually not sure how I could do anything today that would make me prepared for the problem that you identify, or even for like the bigger unknown problem of what AGI would mean. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I have a few thoughts. One is I wish the AI industry didn't pursue AGI. I wish they had focused on building tools with AI. And, there's the OpenAI route towards AGI, OpenAI, Anthropic, and then there's kind of the DeepMind route, which is like, let's solve protein folding with AI. And if the whole industry had been focused on different tools, as opposed to focused on making AI as much like human intelligence as possible, it would have progressed much more slowly. A lot fewer people would have made a lot of money by now, but I think we'd be at much less risk. But it's too late, right? We've pursued AGI. We're going there. We're going to get there. I would like it to come slowly. So we have time to think through these questions. So we have time to set up our social norms. So we have times to the extent that there's useful regulatory policy that's possible, the extent we can do that. But most importantly, so we can set up social structures, norms, and respond to this very crazy world we're about to head into. My general level of confidence that we will handle our first interactions with AGI, whatever that is, my general level of confidence is pretty low. I think it's going to be disruptive, disorienting. But, humans have dealt with a lot of technological change and we'll get through it. And then, so for my own personal, how I will handle it personally, I do try to, you need to set up like separate social structures outside of, I can't remember what philosopher said, there needs to be like a third space in your life. And like part of what is happening with loneliness in American life is the lack of the third space, right? You have your family. Everybody still goes back to their family, I guess, for these people, these bots, but like family's pretty solid, right? Getting less solid because everybody's on their phone, but pretty solid. There's work, right? Which is getting less solid because nobody comes into the office anymore. They come in now more than they did a year ago, but there's like less like physical connection with each other and, coffee. And then there's the third, which is like, what are the social structures? Where do you go outside? Do you go to church? Do you go to the bowling league? Do you go play pickup soccer? And that's really important. And that's declined a lot in America. And that's led to some of the social issues we have. And so I try to constantly make sure, okay, so where are the third spaces? Where I'm meeting new people? Am I going to go play the pickup soccer? Am I like talking to the other parents? When I'm at my kids, soccer games? Am I running with other people, right? Making sure, and then because of my job, I'm constantly connected and networking. So it's less of a problem for me, but thinking through it with my children and other people I know, trying to make sure there is all of this human connection outside of our devices.
Hmm. I love that as an antidote to kind of the question of AGI is cultivating human third places.
Yeah.
That's the cool. I wanted to go back for a second because you mentioned two risks. One around kind of the, I'm excited to read Caitlin's piece, by the way, Sex Without Women. I think it's a huge epidemic. And I think with robots and where things are going there, I think it's only going to get worse. By the way, there's also the kind of existential economic implications of declining population, right? Which, so let's not go there yet. But the other thing, or maybe ever, I don't know. The other risk that you mentioned was this cognitive offloading. And to me, I really want to go back to that because I think there's something really profound here that even was just coming to my mind as you were speaking, which is we talk a lot about, Henrik uses this phrase, Iron Man suit, right? All of a sudden we have this power up that's incredible that we didn't have before. And to me, as I think about the danger of cognitive offloading, which we could define as almost a learned helplessness, now we can't do the task because the AI is doing it. One thing is relative to our current capabilities. A whole other level is cognitive offloading relative to my Iron Man spacesuit, right? If I become used to being able to bench press 1,000 pounds, so to speak, metaphorically speaking, at some point I can't afford to not be using AI because like my human arms are so like, even if I can still bench press 225 or whatever, it's nothing compared to 1,000. And I think right now the value proposition of a lot of AI is you can amplify yourself. You can 10x your output. But then we get in this weird world where relative to my 10x self, I can't ever afford to not. I was just by way of analogy, I was talking with a good friend who was telling me he's realized like on a dopamine scale, we all have children. And he was saying he was watching one of his kids bathe, he's sitting there by the bathtub and then he got a notification on his phone. And he remembered this book or talk that he heard recently where apparently, from a long history perspective, we live on, say, a dopamine scale of like 1 to 10. And, watching your kid bathe maybe is like an 8, which is very enjoyable and great, whatever. Now that we have notifications, everything, they're kind of triggering us on dopamine that's literally off the scale. And his comment was, it's not fair to my child because she literally can't compete with this device. Like the only dopamine hit she can give me is black and white compared to the color of my device. And that really struck me, kind of wanting my kids to be in color, so to speak, really struck me. It seems to me that in regards to kind of the cognitive augmentation that's possible with AI, the danger is it puts our human lives in black and white in a, by way of analogy. How do we think about the responsibility to get power upped versus the danger of now that we're power upped, we can't be normal?
That's a great question with a lot in there. So I suppose that part of the answer is a little bit related to what I was just saying. So, for your friend, he should turn off all the notifications, right? And that's, one thing that I do and one thing that everybody should do, right? Your phone should never, you should get no notifications. I still allow myself to get notifications from Signal because it's a channel that is only used by like my general counsel and the editor-in-chief, right? Like and then I allow notifications from my wife via iMessage, and that's it, right? And so part of being able to be human in this world is making sure that these devices, which are designed by the smartest people of my generation to take away all your attention and give it to them so they can profit off of it. Part of the challenge for us with social media and with phones has been to put them into black and white instead of color. That's going to be a much harder challenge with AGI. It will be to make sure that the benefits that are coming from AI or phones, whatever device we strap on to suddenly be able to bench press 1,000 pounds instead of 225. By the way, bench pressing 225 is pretty impressive.
Yeah, I was also like, are you doing 225, man? That's very impressive.
That's good stuff. Learning, figuring out when we actually need that and when we don't need that will be one of the great challenges. And then back to the cognitive offloading. I do think that morally, spiritually, and even intellectually, there will be no point where AI is so powerful that your unwired intelligence won't matter, right? There's no point where no point in the foreseeable future where AI is so good.
Why do you say that?
Everything I've seen about AI, and as I've seen people using AI, the smarter they are when unwired, right? The organic self has a real effect on how well they can use AI. So
Yeah.
y-
Yeah.
if you can bench 225 when you attach AGI, you bench 1,000. If you can bench 150 when you attach AGI, you can bench 800, right? So there's no there's no point I've seen, and I imagine that strengthening our unwired facilities won't matter. And so then if you believe that, then it means that you should be constantly trying to figure out how to strengthen your unwired capabilities. And
Mhm.
you should be taking time where you're disconnected and you're thinking, and you're walking, and you're just reading a book from beginning to end, as opposed to like firing it into the AI and asking for a smart summary. Um, so keeping those skills strong will always, for the foreseeable future, be an important thing.
What do you think those skills? I think it's a tremendous, interesting point. In the same way that you're running not to get away from a bear or to get food anymore, you're running, because of enjoyment, but also kind of like to push yourself as a human.
Yeah.
If you're looking at the skills that what is the equivalent of bench pressing as a knowledge worker?
You mean cognitively?
Yeah. In the AI space, like what is it that we need to become, one that you think was like reading the book from A to B. So clearly whole concentration, even like when things are not kind of spoon fed for you, seem to be one that you identified. Are there other of those kind of skills that we should think about that we should keep honed?
I mean, yeah, it's like, let's go back to parenting, right? So your kids in the bath, being able to engage with them, like figure out the right thing that they need and figure out the right way to communicate them. They don't have an AGI device while they're 2 years old, right? Being able to talk with them on their level. And I sometimes ask the AI, right? Like my 14-year-old son has this, complicated thing he's working with at school. How can I help him through it? But most of our interactions are very independent. They're person to person. And I can either give good, helpful parenting advice, or I can give bad parenting advice. So that's true of relationships, particularly with young people who won't have been introduced to this technology, but also with other people, right? I have dinner with my wife. We're disconnected from our phones. How do she's got to make a big job decision, right? I can ask the AI, like, help me think through this job decision that she's making. But really it's, you want to be able to do that disattached. So it's human interactions, it's emotional interactions, but it's also just thinking creatively. If I think about I ask AI all the time, right? I asked it. In fact, I had deep research just the other day, right? I figured, let's see, I haven't used up my 10 credits for March. Let's have it like think through the grand strategy of the Atlantic, right? So here are the various problems, like sort through what we should launch next. And so I do use it even for, it didn't give me anything I didn't know. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately. Unfortunately, in the sense that it didn't give me any new ideas. Fortunately, that it suggests that I won't be fired immediately. So I do use AI for even those hardest tasks, but I also think that the more knowledge I have disconnected about the grand strategy of the Atlantic, the better choices I'll make, even if I'm relying on AI.
I love the comment you made about ability, thinking about, for example, engaging with a child as an ability that has to be cultivated. And I think, devices have already somewhat intruded, right? I happen to see, if I'm out to dinner, the number of children that are on devices, but then I look at their parents, they're on devices too.
Yeah.
I think it's an ability that's not being cultivated, set aside AI just because of our device obsession now. But I think framing it as an ability is so important, because if you frame it as an ability worth cultivating, then I can put it on my radar as something to attend to. I think right now, the sad truth is it's not even being attended to, which is why it's being neglected.
Yeah, I think there's two elements of that, which kind of, one thing is, I had the same thing. I've been skiing a lot this season, and I was skiing with my 5-year-old, and I was realizing that I was kind of thinking about, as I was skiing with him, what I was doing next. And then obviously got immense guilt because I was skiing with my 5-year-old. What can be any better, right? Nothing could be better. But I also then realized that
we praised Jeremy's bench press. Getting your kids skiing at 5 is good.
Is full French fries. But what I was realizing was that I've trained my whole life being very concentrated when I sit and do work. Like I'm pretty much in full flow when I sit and have this conversation, and when I do emailing, because I've done it for a long time. I'm very trained in doing it. Obviously skiing with a 5-year-old, I haven't done my whole life, and so therefore, but I think, and then that was just kind of like a way for me to think about it as kind of reshifting my ability to be good at different kind of like things in life. Right? I'm good at work, but now I also would like to be very good at being present while skiing with my 5-year-old. But I think what we're also saying here is that not only will that in itself become important because that will keep us human? But I think the really big reason why listeners of this podcast should be interested is that it might even make us better off using AI, right? And I think it's such an important point. Like if you can mentally and as a human do stuff that is uniquely human, originality and all these different things, you can probably even get much more out of AI that way. And so it's a little bit of the vax on, vax off version of becoming good of AI.
I think that's very, very well stated.
It reminds me of one of my favorite comments on this podcast ever. Nicholas, we had a woman, an advertising executive named Ginny Nicholson on the show. And one of the things she talked about was bringing your humanity to the model, because it's really the only thing that's not already in there. And so if you aren't foregrounding your humanity, then you're not getting any differential output from a model, because you can get what anybody else can get. And that speaks to, Henrik, I love the wax on, wax off. There actually has to be, or as Nicholas, as you put it, an unwired capacity that's being developed to get differential output from a model, period. And I think unwired capacities I don't know that we've talked about it in such terms before. I love that. I wanted to ask you about deep research, the grand strategy of Atlantic, not because I want to know about that per se, but because it reminds me of, we've talked a lot about you as a runner, as a content creator, as a futurist, right? We haven't really touched on you as a leader of an organization. Can you talk for a little bit about how has AI affected your ability to lead, practices to lead, et cetera?
Yeah, that's very hard. So there are a whole bunch of different dimensions for it. And I can go deep in any one of them, but the first is trying to set the strategy, right? So AI was trained on the kind of data that we produce, in fact, specifically on the data that we produce, and is creating competitors to what we produce. And so navigating a future in which there are AI-based competitors, and not only that, navigating a future in which the primary way people find our content, which is through Google search, will gradually go away because Google will just answer the questions instead of directing you to the Atlantic, right? So that's part of it. So I have to figure out our strategy for that. Then there's the strategy on how we relate with these companies, right? And so these companies are great allies, and that they've built tools that are extremely useful to us, but they also, stole our copyrighted content and did not pay it for us. And there's a little bit of an adversarial relationship there, but also a potentially beneficial relationship. So I negotiate that. There's the question of how we use AI inside the Atlantic, right? I use it obviously all the time to make my videos better, to think about the grand strategy of Atlantic. I am trying to get my staff. I tell them very specifically, never use it for writing. Don't use it for writing because it's unethical, because we might lose copyright, and because it's bad. But, beyond that, like, you should be trying and you should be using it for all kinds of different things. And I should note, I don't oversee the editorial side of Atlantic. I just run the business. But, figuring out how we can use AI in our, Facebook marketing is really important. Like, that is one of the main drivers of our growth, which has been massive, right? We switched over to, writing certain things with AI. It was extremely helpful. So figuring out how to get it to flow through the organization, that's really important. And then the other thing, as anybody who reads The Atlantic knows, the staff has been quite critical of the AI industry and, in fact, of the deals that we've struck, right? There's a story about me in The Atlantic called Deal with the Devil, right? Or Bargain with the Devil or something like that, right? So there is there's a back and forth, between, internally as well, that is complicated to manage. So those are all like amazing vectors to work with. And, it's been stressful at times. It's been exciting at times. Whatever it is, it's working because the Atlantic is, firing on all cylinders, and we're bringing in subscriptions at a faster rate than we've ever had. Our advertising is through the roof. Like, it's going well, or all the factors combined are going well, but it is not a simple issue.
No kidding.
Has it been difficult to convince an organization to use AI when you work in an industry that, probably more than many others have been kind of affected by AI already? So to your point, there's this kind of like very polarizing kind of like relationship.
100%. It's very interesting because, the closer you are to the AI training, the sooner you'll be disrupted, right? That's what coders are getting disrupted very quickly. Journalism, media getting disrupted. And that's scary. But if it scares you so much, you kind of put up your hands and say, go away, AI, then the disruption happens faster, right? If you fight AI, will make your job worse sooner. And I talk about it a little bit like one of the metaphors I used in an all hands when I was going back and forth on this issue is look, there is a storm coming, right? And the storm is AI, and it's going to massively change the way people do journalism. And I can say, I don't like the storm, and I can go stand out there naked and I can yell at it, right? Or I can put on a raincoat, I can get an umbrella, and I can try to figure out the path of the storm and how best to protect what I do, right? And that's what we're trying to do, which is let's figure out the AI companies that we can work with. Let's figure out the companies with whom we can make licensing deals. Let's understand their economics. Okay, they're cash poor but equity rich. Let's understand like how that changes the dynamic, right? Let's think about what the actual value of our content is to them, right? Let's think about how that's going to change as we move into a world of synthetic data. If you understand how AI works, how it was built, where it is going, if you understand that better today than you did yesterday, you have a better chance of making the right choices for your company. And that is a conversation that I am having continually, both with other media companies and with my own staff, because there is so much fear and so much anger. And the anger is justified, right? These companies came, they scraped our sites, they ignored our terms of service, they ignored our robots.txt. There have been lawsuits that have been filed, but those are going to take forever, at which point they will no longer have a need for our training data. And so there's this original sin that all these models are built on. And in fact, right now, they're all asking the Trump administration to be given sort of a permanent get out of jail free card on this issue. So there's this original sin that makes this industry quite angry, and the anger is justified. But if that anger then leaves you to make stupid decisions, I got angry, so I shot myself in the foot. That's not a great choice.
So you say you're talking about this all the time with other media companies, with your own staff. Can you talk for a minute about, as a leader, what are the forums or mechanisms where you're talking with your own staff? How are you talking about it? And just to give you one example, we had Brad Anderson, who's one of the presidents of Qualtrics. He worked for Satya for a bunch of years, top 20 leader at Microsoft for like 8 years. He's now at Qualtrics, and he told us a story about how in every all hands meeting, he takes 5 minutes and he shares his screen and he shows people what he's using AI for. Yeah. That's, to me, that's a kind of a hallmark leadership behavior of not telling people to do something, but showing them what you're doing. Can you talk about what are the mechanisms? How are you leading your staff to explore?
Yeah, I might take that actually. I do these monthly all hands and I, talk about it, and I talk in general about how I use AI and what I use it for and what I don't. But I haven't done the share the screen method. I have often, I'll walk to people's desks. I spend a lot of time trying to walk around the office and, why don't we try let's upload this proposal and let's see what the AI says about this proposal and how to make it better. We've built a very small team that is trying to build AI products that makes people's jobs faster. We had a 3-hour training session with OpenAI on how to build custom GPTs just this week, which was wonderful. So there are a few forums, right? There's the all hands forum. There's a Slack channel where we're uploading and discussing tools. And then there are also some particular complexities where we are set up in such a way that the editorial side, I have no idea what The Atlantic is going to publish today. Not one idea. I don't have a single clue, right? We are set up with total separation, and for good reason, because if the folks managing the money had any influence whatsoever on the people writing the stories, then you would write different stories and they wouldn't be as pure. And so we have a total church-state divide. So I can say all I want, but half the staff, should not listen to me. I mean, they can listen to me, but they don't report to me.
What's an example of a tool that you guys are thinking about that would make work easier?
Well, maybe I'll talk about my own journalism use. So one of the things, I was a journalist for most of my life. I was editor Wired before becoming CEO of The Atlantic. So I was on the other side of the house. And so I care a lot about it and I spent a lot of time doing it. When I moved into the CEO role, I kept writing because I was writing a book. I was writing a book about my life running. The general hypothesis is that you look really closely at running, you can understand some of the hardest things in life. And the book is now done, almost done. It'll be out in October. And I used AI in a bunch of ways that were very helpful. One of the things I would do is I would they're characters I interviewed, and I interviewed them over the course of 4 years. Right? So there are lots of notes and their files. And I would upload the transcripts of all those conversations. And I would have the AI look at the transcripts and have the AI look at what I'd written about the character. And I would say, is everything that I've written accurate based on what's in these transcripts? And are there any quotes in the transcripts that are better than the ones that I've selected? Or is there anything that I've left out? Right. And it's extremely good at that. I use it for identifying, I was having a conversation about alcoholism and running. And I was thinking, God, where do I put this in the book? Right? I could go in this chapter about this guy who's dealing with drug addiction. Could go in the 1970s where my father starts to run and like becomes alcoholic. It could come in the 80s where he's like really struggling with it. Where should I put it? And so I write a few sentences about alcoholism and running. I say, hey, where in the manuscript should this go? And it gave me a bunch of very good suggestions, right? Because it can read it instantly. Right. If I'd sent it to my editor would probably have had a better suggestion, but it would have taken 4 hours, whereas you can get, AI to do it instantaneously. And so there are all these use cases that are really useful, even for kind of serious journalism and writing. Those aren't things that, they're just practices that I think journalists and writers use.
I might give you an extra one because I have a book coming out August 5th called Me, My Customer and I, about AI and entrepreneurship. And a little tool that I just kind of like came up with was I'm just getting all the endorsement blurbs kind of getting done. And obviously people are, obviously want to read the book, but then sometimes, it's tough to write an endorsement. So I now have like a custom GPT that have read the book, and then I feed them in the LinkedIn profile of whoever I'm asking for endorsement. And then I say, like, basically try to come up with endorsement, make 3 different versions, make something that's kind of anchored in what this person is an expert in, and then also like outline like something specifically in the book. And it's quite remarkable what it comes up with. Obviously, it makes it much easier.
That's amazing. That's like, yeah, the book endorsement that of all the parts of our industry, they're going to get blown up. I think that's
So Nick, here's a question going back to something you said about the Atlantic earlier, and then this example with your book, which I love. What is writing? And I ask that specifically because you said it's unethical to use it in writing, but then you just gave, and I know that there's an answer here, but just help resolve this tension, because you also said, I used to see, where should this quote go? Did I pick the best reference, right? To me, those sound a lot like writing. How do you define writing when you say don't use it for writing? And then how do you describe what you're doing where you say it's actually really good at doing this part?
Aha, very astute observation. So an AI purist, and there are many smart people in my field who would say, look, writing is thinking. And if you use AI at any part in the process, you are corrupting your learning, right? And it's unethical and it's a form of cognitive offloading. Therefore, you should remove AI from the entire process, right? And that is a very pure approach. At the other end of the spectrum would be, what we've seen at CNET, what we've seen at Sports Illustrated, where it's like, let's just have AI completely create this and, and let's, put a fake byline on it. And so it is true that my position is somewhere in the middle. And the line that I draw is there's not one word in the book that will have been written by AI or even suggested by AI. I don't ask it for synonyms. I never say, rewrite this sentence or give me another suggestion on this sentence. So you could draw the line at a bunch of different places. You could, for example, say, well, maybe it should never write like a paragraph, right? You could maybe say you should never talk to it about anything editorial. I happen to just draw the line at no words came out of the AI, 0, right? Not 1, 0. Now, why draw the line there? A, it's clear, right? And it's a good place to draw a line. And B, there's the additional advantage of the question about copyright. Like it is unclear where the legal lines will be drawn over who owns the right to a work if an AI helps to write it. So if I say, hey, GPT-7, like write a book about running, include profiles of these characters, right? Turns out a book and I publish it. Who owns the right to it? Do I own it? Does OpenAI own the rights to it, right? Does Microsoft own the right to it? Does the Chrome browser, right? And, we don't know the answer to that question. It hasn't been determined by the courts. And so there's this additional advantage that the line that I think is sensible also kind of lines up with legal risk aversion.
Yeah.
It will be interesting if, my argument will be weakened if the courts decide this and you no longer have a copyright position.
I also think back to your point about context window. I mean, like I wrote a book about entrepreneurship and AI, and that was based on a lot of internal white papers that we'd written over the last few years. And honestly, I would have almost preferred AI to write it. And you just couldn't get it to kind of like create a consistent narrative. And to your point about, writing is thinking, obviously at the time you then sit down and kind of like go through all this different stuff, then all these kind of original ideas kind of materialize. And so I also just think like practically, like, of course it can write a book because it could spew out endless amount of just
Well,
copy.
and there are tons of examples, Nick, even on our show. For example, we had Steven Johnson, who's one of my favorite writers who built Notebook LM. Right, he talked about how he's using Notebook LM for his next book project. We talked to, Kevin Kelly, Wired founder, who talked a little bit about that, more about image and now song. He's really into that area. But Guy Kawasaki, I love this example. If you want like a fun example, he talked about he needed an illustration. He needed a real story to illustrate a point about, say career transitions, I think. And he said he asked AI, hey, what are some radical career transitions? And it helped him realize Julia Child had actually, before she got into French cooking, she had been a spy. And she had been on assignment in France and fell in love with French cooking. He said, it surfaced an example that I never would have. Otherwise, he's like, I'm thinking of Bezos, and I didn't really want to include Bezos in that part of my book, right? I think about Ethan Mollick, who wrote a great book, Co-Intelligence, about AI. He talked about how he'd get stuck in a paragraph and he'd say, hey, what are 10 ways I could take this paragraph, right? So to me, it seems there's an enormous spectrum. And that's why I wanted to get your thoughts on, what is writing, because I think somebody could hear the statement earlier in the show, don't use it for writing, and they just write off all of these kinds of thought processes just kind of unthinkingly. And so I wanted to dig into that more.
Yeah, I'll say, okay, so great. I'll also add that I do think that there is I haven't explored this in part because I work for a conservative, my publication, was founded in 1857 by people trying to like stave off the Civil War. Like I, by nature, have to be conservative, right? Like you don't want to be anywhere, like you kind of think of like, okay, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau are like looking over your shoulder, right? You want to be pretty cautious when you work at the Atlantic, right? I do think that there is a future state, right? And it's more for somebody like Kevin Kelly or a publication like Wired to use AI, not just for writing, but to generate new forms of storytelling, right? So Steven Johnson did this with this wonderful thing he put out a couple months ago where we had a story where the AI is like guiding you through it. It's like a choose your own adventure story. Then I once had a startup called The Atavist where one of the initial models was we'll build a CMS or multimedia storytelling, including potentially choose your own adventure books. And AI can do that in a way that traditional writing can't. So I do think that there are, I'm very conservative in the way I write my book about running. I wrote a book for my kids. I guess my 14-year-old and I wrote it for the 10-year-old on his birthday, printed it out. And it was about these stories I told him about the Animal World Cup where different animals play against each other in soccer, right? And it's, instead of like Germany versus the Netherlands, it's like the slugs versus the raccoons, right? And we wrote the national anthems using AI and we illustrated it using DALL-E. Like, I don't care on that, right? That's like the perfect use case for AI. And so it's, I just have different modes, right? And in some ways, if I was an independent writer, had a Substack, or I was at Wired, or I was at some different publication, I may say, like, you use AI to like experiment. You be aware of the hallucinations, be aware of the copyright issues, be aware of the fact that a lot of the prose it spits out is generic and cliched because it's been trained on generic prose. And, go and do other things. It's not right, though, for the Atlantic.
Yeah. No, but you also, one thing that you're bringing to my mind is the importance of playing. You talk about making the Animal World Cup illustrations. I think right now, a lot of folks who maybe are unfamiliar or who are just kind of dipping their toes, AI is kind of a productivity tool. Therefore, it fits in the productivity suite. It sits next to PowerPoint and Excel, and it triggers kind of very particular associations. And then there's this whole other world or sandbox around, kids' story time. I think if folks aren't playing in their personal lives, their imaginations aren't going to be sufficiently, kind of call it, loaded to even know what's interesting at work.
That's so interesting, right? And it gets back to cognitive offloading, right? Like imagination and skills and letting your mind wander, right? I think Steven Johnson said this in the podcast with you. He said that we talked about the importance of, I can't remember exactly what he said, but you would remember since you were interviewing him. I was just listening. But he was saying that like one of the reasons why it's important to go for a walk, he said in order to reach an interesting idea, you kind of have to hop through 6 different things that you can't get to the interesting idea immediately. And so you need to like be detached and let your mind be wandering. And so AI can like cut you off because it can like, get you tethered to your screen, or it can get you so reliant that you don't trust your imagination anymore. Or you can use it to help infuse your imagination and inspire it.
The last question for me, which probably is with your futurist hat on, we talk a lot about writing for people, but obviously you're alluding to SEO, kind of increasingly people might come through whatever agent they're asking for something, and then that'll point to the inventing. Well, when will it just be my agent that will read your stuff and then tell me in the kind of like the tone and the way that I would like to have it told?
I mean, in a way, that happens now, right? If you go into Grok and you're like, hey, tell me what happened today, right? It's reading Atlantic stories and telling you that. So, and you're asking Grok your specific way. If you go into Perplexity, or, you go into lots of sites, they're doing that. I mean, you can even remove the written word and you can go into Amazon Alexa, right? Or you can just say to your Alexa bot, right? Hey, tell me what happened today. And it will be responding with data that it's, fortunately licensed from a whole series of publishers. So I don't think we're that far away. And you can see also there are all kinds of apps out there, right? The first one was Artifact, right? Wonderful app created by Kevin Systrom and Mike Krieger, where it would summarize the stories, right? And so in a way, that's like your agent, because you're choosing what kind of summarization you want, what length, right? So you have an agent that, it used to just be our relationship with you is direct. There's our text that we write and there's you as a reader. Now there's tech companies in the middle, their agents in the middle, there's
Particle and with other things now.
Particle does this as well. And so we have to, like, with my CEO hat on, not as my dad Animal World Cup hat on, I have to figure out how to make sure that our business can survive in that world, which is not an easy challenge.
One thing, Nick, just maybe last memory or just statement, if there's something that's interesting. I'll say last question. When you and I ran into each other downtown Palo Alto, you're walking around and I accosted you in the street. I realized we had met at a previous conference, but you said, hey, anything interesting I should talk about in my video today? Mm-hmm. And I thought that was to me, it reminded me of, when I'm in book writing mode, as they say, as a writer, everything's grist for the mill. Yeah. Is that your kind of, call it, receptors open mode? When you think about your daily video, are you kind of always thinking about that? And because to me, it was like, I don't understand biology at all, but like antioxidants will grab an acai berry or whatever, or vice versa. Is that your kind of primary receptor mode? Is you're looking for stuff you want to be talking about? Because it was striking to me that was the first thing that came up in conversation.
It's probably not the first. I think the question I'm asking the most is, what do you think of the Atlantic, right? Because my goal is to manage our brand perception. And like, you want to get an early indicator on, I love the Atlantic, but I can't get it to renew properly, right? Or the font is too small, right? And so you're trying to constantly get feedback on that. I used to drive my sisters crazy. They would just get so annoyed by it. I used to, when I was back on the other side of the house, like I'd approach every cocktail party as, well, let's like, somewhere in this room, there is an amazing New Yorker story, right? Like, I'm going to find it before the night ends. And they're like, why are you asking our friends these questions? I'm like,
that's hysterical.
How I am. And I, to some degree, the most interesting thing in tech is part of that. In some degree, it's, the more general quest to understand AI, which I think underlies so many of the most important choices I'll have to make in the next few years. And then to the biggest degree. But yes, I do have that receptor mode, and I am always asking questions like that. And it was fun to bump into you. That was early in the morning too. It's like 7:30 in the morning. We were walking down Emerson Street.
Yeah. Wow. Good memory. I think Victor Hugo's son said, everything ends up in print.
Yeah. Right. I mean, Steve Martin said that, look, everything in your life will eventually end up in your act. Right. And so once you recognize that, you realize that, no matter what you're doing, you could be finding an idea that's valuable to whatever it is you're working on.
That's incredible.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Perfect note from a creativity perspective to end on, for sure. I mean, that was a pretty wide-ranging conversation, wasn't it?
It really was.
I think for someone who's as steeped in futurism and current technology trends as he is, it's super fun to not only talk to him as a creator, but also as a runner, as a father, as a leader and executive. I'm sure in that episode, I feel like there's something for everybody. And our job is to make it practical, pragmatic, and to leave folks with some simple takeaways that they can apply into their life. What are you, maybe let's start this way, Henrik. What are you taking into your life from this conversation?
You know what? And I think I'm taking a pretty profound lesson with me, which is how do I practice skills and traits of humanity that I have? How do I train them? I mean, like I was thinking when we were talking, when somebody has a tough time getting a romantic partner, then sometimes the trick is not to kind of become better at finding a partner, is to kind of upgrade themselves, right? You know, go to the gym or go to the studio. There's also, go to the dance studio, like just become a more interesting person. In the same way, I heard once when, you know, the founder of Virgin said, Richard Branson said, was asked famously, if you had only one piece of advice to an entrepreneur, what would that be? And he answered, go to the gym. And so for a podcast that is all about how to become better of applying AI to your business and to yourself, I think it's actually like such an interesting, very, very true, but also kind of a counterintuitive kind of thing of like, one of the things that we have to remember to keep training is our ability to see when the model is hallucinating. Like, and that is not an AI skill, that's a human skill. To be better of being very unpredictable in the way that we ask the model, right? Because originality in gets originality out. And then I think as somebody who are kind of leaders in their AI fields, and I would imagine that most people who listen to this are kind of like considerate AI thought leaders, or at least like, you know, knowledgeable about it. We have an interesting responsibility in making sure that we don't become so lazy that we suddenly lose the ability to use AI in an effective way, to effectively, as you were kind of pointing it out. We need to be able to bench press 225 pounds in order to bench press 1,000 with AI. But if we become so lazy that we can't bench press more than 20 pounds, you know, then we're also not taking advantage of this technology. And so I think this idea of practicing the human side of yourself, either because it's good for you as a human, but also because make it better for you to become a super user of AI, is just such a fascinating point.
Yeah, unwired intelligence and cultivating our organic selves, I thought was very cool. I love, you know, the thought of cultivating abilities like talking to a child, like holding a meaningful conversation with a romantic partner without intervention, you know, of technology. I think that it sounds Luddite, but, you know, spoken from someone who's at the bleeding edge, I think it causes those of us who've been dismissive of, call it, mere human capabilities, you know, it brings a healthy skepticism to say, am I attending to all the aspects of my life? As much as I should be able to bring various models to bear on improving my running, you know, regimen, as Nicholas is, I should be able to leave devices behind and be fully present with my family. And recognizing that if I can't do the latter, I probably won't be very good at the former. To me, that's a really cool kind of interplay and interdependence that I don't think we've teased out as much, maybe a little bit in our conversation with Jenny about bringing humanity to the model. But I thought that was really special. I agree.
You know, also just like as a personal observation, like he's so good of completing full sentences. You know, like just, you know, you ask him a question, he comes with this very powerful, very impressive kind of answer, and it's like compact, and then he stops. Right.
Yes. Yes. I think that's probably a function of his daily practice of recording these videos,
Yeah.
you know, because you've got to have a clear open, you know, midsection, mid game, so to speak, and end. And he's cultivated that ability. I mean, if for folks who don't follow him, he's got 2 million followers on LinkedIn. It's follow him. And every day there's a very short video. It's very thought provoking, but as Henrik's saying, it's a complete thought and there's a clear end. You like that?
You and I are just begging to kind of continue.
You know, the other thing that I thought was really fascinating is his comments the closer your organization is to the training data, the sooner you're going to be disrupted. And I love this quote: fighting AI is just going to make your job worse sooner. Don't fight it. Instead, embrace it, find ways to incorporate it. And as he said, get the rain slicker, get the umbrella, and try to figure out where the storm's going rather than standing naked, screaming at the wind.
I think that was it for this time. Thank you for everybody listening, and thanks for people who are writing in and putting comments on LinkedIn and YouTube and on the various podcasting platforms. Obviously, to everybody who subscribed, it means a lot to us.
Hey, whoa. Henrik, one thing we got to do is we've got to have a code word. People are getting into the code words. I don't know if you're noticing this.
What's the code word for this one?
Unwired rain slicker.
I wouldn't be able to spell to that, but there you go.
Well, now we'll see what you. Okay, so if you got to the end of this episode, drop us a comment on social. Unwired rain slicker will know that you got here. Thanks for listening, as always. See you next time.